and welcome to PCB Chat, where we talk with experts across the printed circuit design, manufacturing, and electronic supply chain fields. I'm Mike Buetow, president of the PCBAA. The CHIPS Act has hogged much of the oxygen in the tech industry for the past few years. But the industry trade group known as the Printed Circuit Board Association of America is trying to build on that momentum by relentlessly pointing out that the board industry needs love too, or as they put it, chips don't float. With us today is David Schild, the executive director of the PCBAA. David, it's good to have you back on PCB Chat.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mike.
In a recent op-ed in the Chicago Sun-Times, which, I think I saw you on LinkedIn say something about, you're referencing your hometown or one of your hometown papers. And, it's sort of my adopted hometown growing up in Illinois. The heads of three prominent board makers argue that the CHIPS Act is incomplete on its own and needs a boost in the form of a separate bill that supports investment for PCB manufacturers and tax credits for domestic buyers. A similar column bylined by top execs at two major suppliers was published in the Hartford Courant in May. Now, as you may have heard, it's an election year here in the US. In all the decision-making going on regarding the presidential primaries, what is your sense from Congress insofar as this legislation is concerned?
Sure. In an election year, there can be a great deal of distraction from the normal business of governing. And that's kind of the glass half empty view of doing things in an election year. I tend to take the glass half full view, which is, hey, now manufacturing is on the ballot. And probably rarely as an issue, it has broad bipartisan support. I don't think you'll find people on either side of the aisle in any state, red or blue, who are against making more high technology components that we depend on here in the United States. Sometimes the motivation is national security reasons. Sometimes the motivation is supply chain resiliency and economic robustness. But regardless of why you think it's a good idea, it tends to be something that brings people together. Now, I know that there wasn't 100% agreement on the CHIPS Act when it passed, but it did have broad bipartisan support. So I'm encouraged when you see these regional op-eds, and we're really grateful for the folks at American Standard Circuits and Amatron for stepping up to lend their voices to this effort. When you see these regional op-eds, it reinforces something really important, Mike. Not only is this a bipartisan issue, this is an issue that really stretches into almost every community in America, right? We have at least 28 states with folks manufacturing boards and the critical components that go into printed circuit boards. So there are very few lawmakers who can say, this doesn't affect me and I'm not touched by this. And of course, in the broader microelectronics ecosystem, right, PCBs make it possible. Nothing works without a board. So if your home state happens to manufacture something that requires a semiconductor, guess what? The health of the board industry, that is relevant to you.
So I'm gonna pull on that thread a little bit as we talk more. In May, you called on Congress to add, or I say you, the PCBAA called on Congress to add about $500 million in funding in the fiscal 2025 budget for the Defense Production Act Purchases Program. And that was intended to prioritize printed circuit board investments. I think that President Biden's budget, if I remember right, called for a little less than 400 million, maybe it was closer to 300 million. The DPAP has funded, of course, a couple of programs, the ones at Calumet Electronics and Green Source so far. What more can you tell us about this?
Sure. So we've been encouraged in previous years that the DPA funding has been there for our industry. And as you said, I think there was north of $100 million that was given out last year to companies in our association, in our industry, primarily supporting leading edge defense technologies. Of course, when we go back to 2022, the real victory is the invocation of the Defense Production Act itself, which designates boards and substrates as a critical national security technology. What we were displeased to see, disappointed to see, I would say, was the cut from fiscal year 25 to 26 and this reduction in the specific microelectronics line. We know a lot of that money would end up in PCB manufacturers' hands. So we're working a joint effort with our colleagues at IPC to restore those funds. That battle is not yet fully fought, right? You need to see progress on House and Senate legislation, and then, of course, it goes to the conference. But a number of lawmakers that we've spoken to in the House understand our concerns, and I think their question is, why, after consistent funding in the hundreds of millions of dollars year over year, would the Pentagon place such a large cut into the budget? And so I think our champions on Capitol Hill are looking at this very seriously. I hope we'll be able to report back soon that, hey, we've got some of this money restored, but that battle is still underway on Capitol Hill.
When you ask that question as to why those cuts, or really the I don't know whether to call it a cut or just a lack of an allocation, why that's happened, what kind of response are you seeing?
Sure. So we've been engaged with the Pentagon and the White House on this. And I think first, we have broad support in the executive agencies for a robust manufacturing base. And I think when you look at Dr. Taylor Calais, when you look at Undersecretary LaPlante, the Pentagon gets it. The White House gets it, right? There's not a lack of ideological alignment on we need a robust and secure supply chain. I think there are a lot of budgetary pressures out there, right? Nobody has officially said, hey, this is why this little line item of money was removed, was reduced. But what we're hearing is, well, there's leftover funds in the account. We think these monies are going to be expended, and we're not going to see an interruption in funding. What I will tell you from 25 years in Washington is that a zero tends to become a zero and stay a zero in the budget. We think any cut is a mistake given the billions, tens of billions of dollars that the federal government is pouring into semiconductor manufacturing and research. To be arguing over tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for another critical component in the stack. Of course, chips don't float. Doesn't seem like the right argument and discussion to be having. But this is the legislative sausage making process in Washington, right? The president's budget is submitted. The folks on Capitol Hill in both the House and the Senate, their staff, they look at these recommendations, and that's really what the president's budget submission is, a recommendation to Congress. Changes are made. And then the final bill ends up back on the president's desk. We have been here before as an industry, and I'm confident that we're going to win back a portion or all of what was gone. But, obviously, this also gets lost or sort of loses some of its high profileness when you talk about, hey, the defense budget is already over $700 billion, right? And the full federal expenditures for next year are over $2 trillion. So it can be hard to focus lawmakers' attention when, of course, they're fighting over aircraft carriers and submarines and, really big ticket projects. But of course, none of that works without microelectronics, right? And that's the argument that we and our partners are going to continue to make.
So helping to further that cause is your new champion. As of late May, PCBAA has a new chairman. Most folks, at least domestically, are familiar with Shane Whiteside. Shane is president and CEO of Summit Interconnect, and prior to that, he was COO at TTM. In short, he knows the industry's issues all too well. With the new leadership, are there any expected changes in your approach or your strategy?
I think that you're going to continue to see robust advocacy for our industry in Washington. We were so fortunate that Travis Kelly from Isola stepped up when we were launched 3 years ago with only 5 companies. Summit has been at the table from the beginning. And as Travis's tenure came to an end, Shane, much to his credit, stepped up and said, I'm willing to assume a leadership role here. I think you're going to see a continuity of what we've done. And of course, Shane's deep roots in the industry, the fact that he leads one of the most prominent board manufacturers in the United States, these are all assets. He's also willing to come to Washington, as he did for our annual meeting in June, and actually wear out some shoe leather advocating for our industry on Capitol Hill. So, we've gone from, again, 5 members to 60 as of this week. And I think you're going to see growth under Shane's leadership. I think you're going to see continued advocacy and probably an expansion beyond just defense and aerospace focus into more of a whole of government conversation when it comes to where we source our microelectronics from.
For over 30 years, PCB West has been the ultimate gathering place for PCB designers, engineers, fabricators, and assemblers. Over 2,000 professionals register each year to visit 100+ companies, all in one place, sharing the latest in PCB technology. From high-reliability military and aerospace to the latest in IoT and wearable tech, there's something for everyone in the electronics supply chain. Want cutting-edge insights and the chance to network with industry leaders? You can't afford to miss this show. Brought to you by PCEA, Engineering Tomorrow's Electronics. Head to PCBWest.com and register today.
How closely do legislators look at market share and market size when determining where to push the funding envelope, as it were? Is there a sense that because the US bare board industry is well behind several Asian nations and Japan in terms of size and in some respects their technical prowess, that the gap is too large to spend taxpayer monies on to try to close?
No, and I would say that, 5 or 6 years ago, a similar argument might have been made about US semiconductor production. And I will tell you that the semiconductor industry, when it went in to make its original arguments on the CHIPS Act, led with a number of issues, but one of them was market share and US capacity. And the semiconductor industry essentially hit the panic button, for lack of a better description, when we were at 13% of semiconductors made in the United States. That resulted in the CHIPS Act, $52 billion in private money, by some estimates more than $450 million in private money to match that $52 billion in government funding. We, of course, have slipped from 30% of U.S. or global market share to 4% today. In real terms, as you know, as your audience well knows, that's 2,200 board companies in the year 2000, something like 147 today. So that is a very compelling argument because we talk about where these boards end up, both in the aerospace and defense world and in the commercial sector, and how everything that is a part of modern life is powered by a board. So when we don't have the capacity to manufacture those, it makes supply chain interruptions very intimidating, right? It presents a risk that we don't think lawmakers want to live with or consumers or the American public should be forced to live with. So yeah, Mike, I do think the market share / capacity discussion is something that grabs people's attention. When I go into a congressional office and I point to the clock on the wall or I point to the phone in their hand, right? And I say, guess what? None of this works without a printed circuit board. And the odds are right now that if we crack these technologies open, it's going to probably have an Asian origination, right? Is that a sustainable model for us? Or do we need to diversify our portfolio when it comes to sourcing and supply chains? And all of these offices that voted for the CHIPS Act go, we already had that argument about whether we ought to have a diverse supply chain, whether we ought to have a secure and resilient supply chain. You're just coming in with another part of the stack. And so, yeah, I think it's a compelling argument.
I was reading not long ago, and I think I actually saw this in the PCBAA newsletter, and if folks aren't receiving that, they probably should. There was a link to an article where the Department of Defense's Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office said the DoD is attempting to, quote, be less hard to work with when it comes to modernizing its data and IT infrastructure. And that they further went on and said, we want to leverage the innovative solutions from the world-class software developers in both the traditional and non-traditional industrial base to create capabilities for our warfighters and decision makers, end of quote. Are there similar feelers coming from the hardware side? And if so, what might be the implications for the defense and industrial supply base?
I think the fact that you have an executive agent designated for PCBs and you have essentially sort of a command in Crane in Indiana, we see now, right, whether, again, it's Secretary LaPlante, whether it's Dr. Taylor Calais, any number of officials who have been installed. Molly Just Bear, right, who's the CHIPS coordination cell leader at the Pentagon, right? She spoke to our group in June. What I see at the Pentagon is important people in prominent chairs who have been told to fix this problem. That's usually a sign that an executive agency takes a problem seriously. So I think the answer to your question is, does the Pentagon look at this and say, hey, we got to look down the road 5 years, 15 years, 30 years, and make sure we can get the things that we need? Yeah, if you're staffing up accordingly, I think that's a sign that they take it seriously.
I would expect that despite some of the rhetoric with regard to how federal agencies and different departments are going to look perhaps over the next several years in light of Supreme Court decisions and so forth, that the folks that are in place tied to the Defense Department are fairly well insulated from regardless of which administration is in place come January 2025.
There's always change in Washington. Of course, every 2 years, we turn over a third of the Senate and the entire House of Representatives. And of course, every 4 years, we have the potential for a new administration, and all the chairs that will get filled or changed out when those kinds of adjustments occur. We have been at this for 3 years. Of course, people in the industry have watched change over a period of decades. I am confident that the nature of the problem will not change based on who is in office. The solutions that will work, public investment in this industry, and taxpayer support for a critical technology set that we have to win the future. I don't think that changes because there's someone new sitting in the White House, because there's somebody new as president of the Senate. Yes, things are going to turn over. I can tell you, we've gone into offices, we've done the educational pitch. That member of Congress retires, we have to go in and talk to their successor. That's our job. That's what we're here to do. If the same thing happens at the Pentagon, if the same thing happens at the Department of Commerce, we are going to be a sustainable voice, right? We're the constant, the advocates for our industry. And if we have to educate and then re-educate, we'll do it.
I mentioned earlier I was going to pull on that packaging thread again, and here it comes. So the Biden administration said today, which is July 10th, at Semicon West, that it would allocate up to $1.6 billion in funding for packaging semiconductors, which will be spread out in grants of up to $150 million each. In reporting the announcement, the New York Times quotes our consulting editor, Jan Vardaman, who said, "You can make all the silicon you want here, but if you don't take it to the next step, it doesn't do any good." So there's our chips don't float, just repackaged, right? The government also said more details are coming shortly about the pending National Semiconductor Technology Center, which is a public-private JV for chip research and development. So I know this news just hit, but what have you heard about this new funding announcement? And do you have any sense as to whether private companies will be eligible?
Well, of course, this is breaking news, and I think we're going to need to look closely at the details of these announcements. Whenever CHIPS money or CHIPS allocations are announced, there's usually quite a detailed write-up about the rules and the regs and how the money will actually be deployed. So, let's go through that with a fine-tooth comb before we make any judgments. But what I will say, backing up a little bit, is that it is encouraging to see the Commerce Department, the agency charged with allocating CHIPS funds, take an expansive view of the technology stack, right? When you're beyond pure semiconductor production, which they've obviously funded to the tunes of tens of billions of dollars, and you're into advanced packaging, that's good. There was a $300 million award announced for substrates. And of course, we represent substrate makers or folks who want to be in the substrate business in the United States as well. What we're not seeing yet, Mike, is an expanded view that actually gets into our part of the stack, printed circuit boards. Now, there could be a number of reasons for that, right? The language that Congress passed does constrain executive agencies a little bit. It's called the CHIPS Act for a reason, and that's where the money has been going. This is, of course, why we're pushing for our own legislation, the PCBs, or Protecting Circuit Boards and Substrates Act, our version of the CHIPS Act, and with tax credits and government allocations as well. So I tend to support generally what the Commerce Department is doing in getting this money out the door quickly, and I think so far effectively. But of course, until it starts to hit the American PCB manufacturing base, and until it begins to enable substrate production in the United States, I don't think we're going far enough. And your quote is exactly right. We are not going to solve the overarching problem. Do we make the things that we depend on for modern life in the United States in a sustainable way? Do we own enough market share to be protected, right, from man-made and natural disasters? No, not yet. And we're not going to get there until we sort of incorporate the entire stack.
So it's been an exceptionally hot summer this year in the U.S., and it sounds like you're continuing to bring the heat on Washington on behalf of the circuit board industry.
Yeah, we were really lucky in mid-June, just before the heat wave arrived in the Capitol, that about 50 executives from all over the industry, and I'm really proud, from every sector, right? Assembly, test, packaging, manufacturing, raw materials, refined materials, tooling, right? That's what PCBA is now. It's a diverse collection of folks who share this passion for American microelectronics manufacturing. I almost said descended on Washington. I'll say arrived in force in Washington instead for our annual meeting. We went to Capitol Hill. We engaged dozens of lawmakers who had not previously heard from us. We came away with a bunch of new sponsors for HR 3249, the PCBs Act. And I think it was a unique opportunity for folks all through that ecosystem to actually sit together and compare notes and say, hey, what's the state of the industry? So, I was at the first annual meeting when we were in a much smaller room with a much smaller crowd. And now under Shane's leadership, as I said, 5 dozen companies, right? Instead of just 5. And that's a great place to be. We will be back in Washington this fall and into next year as well. Administrations, members of Congress, they come and go. We're here to stay in terms of delivering this educate, advocate, and legislate message.
David, is there anything else you want to pass along before we wrap?
No, I hope all of your listeners are making the attempt to stay cool like we are. And, it's an election year. We can't take our eyes off the focus on American manufacturing. That's what we're here to do. And we appreciate you helping us get the word out.
Absolutely. Our guest today has been David Schild, Executive Director of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America. You can learn more at PCBAA.org. Stay cool this summer, David.
You too. Thanks, Mike.
For PCB Chat, this is Mike Buetow. Have a nice day.